History tends to spotlight Napoleon Bonaparte as the fierce general who reshaped Europe with sheer military might. The image is iconic, a short, sharp-eyed man standing atop a battlefield, commanding legions with unstoppable force. But what history books often overlook is that beneath the war hero's uniform was a mind equally formidable in the realm of finance. In a world dominated by aristocratic banking dynasties, rigid monetary systems, and fragile trust in state currencies, Napoleon emerged not just as a conqueror of lands, but a disruptor of Europe's entrenched financial order. He didn't just outfight kings, he outwitted bankers. This is the hidden side of Napoleon, a strategic thinker who used money as a weapon and finance as a battlefield. At a time when France was broke, surrounded by enemies, and scorned by investors, Napoleon rebuilt the economy, restored confidence in the currency, and re-engineered how a state could fund endless war, without bowing to the wealthiest institutions in Europe. Today we pull back the curtain on how Napoleon outsmarted Europe's richest banks, and why his financial playbook still echoes in modern strategy. When Napoleon seized power at the turn of the 19th century, France was in a state of near economic ruin. The French Revolution had drained the national coffers, upended centuries of aristocratic wealth, and replaced the monarchy with successive unstable governments. The state had defaulted on its debts. Paper currency had collapsed under hyperinflation, and public trust in financial instruments was nearly non-existent. Assignats, the revolutionary government's paper money backed by confiscated church lands, had become worthless. They were originally introduced to stabilize the economy, but were recklessly overprinted. As faith in assignats crumbled, so too did confidence in France's financial system. Bread riots swept the cities. International bankers turned their backs. Britain, Austria, and Prussia looked on, confident that the Republic would implode under the weight of its own financial mismanagement. It was into this chaos that Napoleon stepped, not as a banker nor as a bureaucrat, but as a soldier, a general whose battlefield victories had made him a hero to the people and a threat to the old elite. Yet it was precisely his outsider status that allowed him to think differently. Where politicians feared the wrath of the markets and hesitated before the banks, Napoleon saw only tools to be used, obstacles to be bypassed, or weapons to be wielded. One of Napoleon's first acts as first consul was to lay the foundation for a new financial order. In 1800, he established the Banque de France. On the surface, it was a national bank, designed to stabilize currency and restore faith in the monetary system. But in truth, it was also a vehicle for centralized control. Napoleon ensured the bank would serve the state, not the other way around. Though partially funded by private investors, the bank was under his direct influence, allowing him to steer its lending, money supply, and policy decisions with the authority of an emperor cloaked in fiscal legitimacy. This was a masterstroke. France's economy needed credibility to attract investment, yet Napoleon knew that handing control back to private financiers, many of whom had ties to foreign powers, would leave the Republic vulnerable. So, he did what few had done before. He merged central state power with banking in a way that reassured capital while preserving control. The franc was reintroduced, minted in gold and silver, to project strength and reliability. Trade and taxation were restructured. He imposed new systems for collecting taxes efficiently, reducing corruption, and maximizing state revenue. But perhaps most critically, Napoleon refused to return to the old system of borrowing vast sums from international financiers. He had no intention of allowing men like the Rothschilds or the Hopes of Amsterdam to dictate terms to France. Instead, he pioneered a financial model that relied on self-funding through conquest, plunder, and internal taxation. This model shocked the European elite. Traditionally, monarchs borrowed heavily to wage war, often indebting themselves to banks that extracted high interest and political favors in return. But Napoleon reversed this. He used war to fund the state, rather than the state to fund war. When his armies swept through Italy, they seized the treasuries of kingdoms and churches alike, sending millions of francs back to Paris. These funds didn't just buy weapons, they financed public works, administrative reforms, and more campaigns. Every victory replenished the war chest, and every campaign was calculated not only in military terms, but economic yield. Napoleon turned war into an investment strategy, a brutal but effective means of sustaining the empire. Across the English Channel, the British economy was deeply intertwined with powerful banking families. The British Crown leaned heavily on institutions like Barings and the Rothschilds, who facilitated enormous war loans and investments. Britain paid for its military supremacy through bonds, funded by an expanding empire and its robust trade networks. Napoleon had none of these luxuries. France's colonial holdings had dwindled, and its economy was still fragile. But Napoleon wielded a different weapon: unpredictability. He recognized that financial markets, like battlefields, thrived on perception and could be manipulated. He began to play mind games with Europe's financiers. Before major campaigns, he would orchestrate diplomatic overtures that gave the illusion of peace. Stocks in London would rise, and credit markets would loosen. Then, without warning, he would strike, catching both armies and investors off guard. This tactic sowed confusion and disrupted the enemy's economic planning. It was psychological warfare waged on bankers. Then came the Continental System, Napoleon's boldest economic gambit. Unable to defeat Britain militarily, he sought to destroy it economically by banning all trade between Britain and mainland Europe. His vision was grand: starve British industry of markets, collapse its financial infrastructure, and isolate it from the continent. Ports were blockaded, smugglers were hunted, and neutral countries were pressured into compliance. The plan had mixed results. It devastated European merchants, many of whom relied on British goods, and smuggling became rampant. Still, it exposed the vulnerabilities of an empire dependent on trade and finance. And once again, Napoleon refused to finance this war through foreign debt. He relied on occupied territories, forced contributions, and controlled inflation. His financial independence made him harder to break. Meanwhile, in countries under his influence, like the Confederation of the Rhine or the Kingdom of Italy, Napoleon imposed new tax codes, reformed banking, and demanded payments in gold. These were not the actions of a mere conqueror. They were the strategies of a man who understood that dominating the financial architecture of Europe was just as critical as winning battles. And through it all, he kept the French people invested. He rewarded loyalty with land, titles, and salaries. He funded public works, built roads, bridges, and monuments. He ensured the spoils of war didn't just stay with the elites, but flowed through society, securing political capital and domestic stability. But as with all grand strategies, Napoleon's financial empire had its limits. Over time, the costs of endless warfare grew unsustainable. As his enemies adapted, his model of conquest as revenue began to strain. The Russian campaign in 1812 was a devastating miscalculation, not only militarily, but financially. The losses in men and material couldn't be recouped through plunder. The occupied territories began to revolt. Revenues dried up. To keep the machine running, taxes were raised at home, and inflation quietly crept back in. The Banque de France, once a symbol of discipline, was leaned on for more funding. Trust began to erode, and foreign bankers, sensing blood in the water, began tightening credit across Europe. By 1814, the empire was collapsing. The man who had once defied the wealthiest institutions on the continent now found himself cornered, not by generals, but by the inevitable mathematics of overreach. When Napoleon abdicated and went into exile, he left behind a France transformed. The financial systems he built remained. The Banque de France endured. Tax reforms survived. The legacy of self-reliant state finance would influence leaders long after his fall. Napoleon Bonaparte was more than a military commander. He was a strategist who understood that the foundations of power are built not only on land and loyalty, but on money. He saw finance not as a constraint, but as a battlefield. He challenged the world's richest banking families without ever taking their loans. He redefined how nations could fund their ambitions, and he left behind a model of financial independence that would inspire revolutions, reformers, and rulers for generations. In the modern world, where central banks steer economies and perception drives markets, the echoes of Napoleon's tactics can still be felt. His story reminds us that power is not always held by those who hold the sword. Sometimes it lies in the hand that controls the coin. Thank you for watching Leader Insight. If this deep dive into the financial side of history's most famous emperor intrigued you, make sure to subscribe for more untold stories of power, leadership, and legacy. And let us know in the comments, Was Napoleon a financial visionary or simply a master of temporary illusion? The debate, like his legacy, continues.